When the Union Army took control of Davidson County in February 1862, they claimed dozens of abandoned properties for military purposes. Most of these places were left in chaos, with furniture knocked over, papers burned, and valuables quickly taken away by Confederate supporters who had fled. This process was normal. Soldiers moved through empty estates, listed what remained, and turned usable buildings into barracks, hospitals, or storage sites. However, the Harwell estate, located about 17 miles southeast of Nashville along the Cumberland River Valley, was not like the others. The three-story house stood completely undisturbed, as though the people living there had disappeared suddenly in the middle of their day. Breakfast dishes still sat on the dining table, food long spoiled. A leather journal lay open on a desk in the study, the ink dried halfway through an unfinished sentence. Clothes hung neatly in closets. Books filled the shelves of the library. A grandfather clock in the entry hall had stopped at exactly 30:47, its pendulum no longer moving. Captain William Morrison of the 3rd Ohio Infantry was one of the first officers to enter the house. His first report, later preserved in National Archives records, described the scene as strangely untouched, as if the residents expected to return at any moment. He noted the fine quality of the furniture, the large collection of farming and scientific books, and what he described as a level of abandonment that went beyond normal wartime evacuation. For 3 days, Morrison's company used the manor as a temporary headquarters while they scouted the nearby area. Soldiers slept in the bedrooms, cooked meals in the kitchen, and used the study to plan operations. It was not until the 4th day, February 19, 1862, that Private James Ketchum, while searching the root cellar for stored food, noticed something out of place. The cellar was large, roughly 40 feet by 30 feet, with stone walls and a hard dirt floor. Along the walls were shelves holding empty jars, broken pots, and burlap sacks. Ketchum began moving the sacks, hoping to find potatoes or turnips underneath. When he struck the floor in one corner, it made a hollow sound. He called for help. 2 other soldiers joined him, and together they cleared away the sacks and debris. Beneath them was a wooden hatch about 3 feet square, fitted with an iron ring handle. The hatch was held shut by a heavy sliding bolt that was rusted but still strong. Ketchum pulled the bolt loose and lifted the hatch. The smell that came up caused all 3 men to pull back at once. It was a foul mix of human waste, rot, and stale air that had been trapped below for months. Ketchum dropped the hatch and staggered away, gagging. One of the other soldiers threw up. Captain Morrison was called to the cellar. When he arrived, he ordered lamps brought down and leaned over the open hatch. A wooden ladder led down into darkness. He called out, but there was no reply. Morrison ordered Private Ketchum to go down, clearly afraid. The young soldier climbed down with a lamp while Morrison and 3 others watched from above. What Ketchum found below stayed with him for the rest of his life. In testimony given to a military investigator 6 days later, he described entering a room carved directly into the bedrock, about 20 feet by 30 feet, with a ceiling just high enough to stand under. The air was thick and disgusting. The lamp's light revealed crude sleeping pallets along the walls, waste buckets in one corner, and an overturned water barrel. Then he saw the children. 8 of them were huddled together in the far corner, filthy and skeletal, shielding their eyes from the light. They wore rags. Their hair was tangled and dirty, their skin showed sores and infections. Some had clear injuries, broken bones that had healed badly, and scars from wounds that were never treated. When Ketchum spoke to them, none answered. They only stared back, faces empty, eyes reflecting the lamp like animals hiding in a cave. He later said he first thought they were dead, like living corpses. They barely moved except to shrink away from the light. They made no sound. One older girl rocked back and forth, her mouth moving without forming words. A boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, scratched the wall again and again with his fingernails in a motion that seemed meaningless. Ketchum climbed back up the ladder and told Captain Morrison what he had seen. Morrison went down himself to confirm it. When he came back up 15 minutes later, his face was pale. He immediately ordered that the surgeon be brought in. It took 3 hours to persuade the children to come out of the underground rooms. They were terrified of the soldiers, frightened by the light, and seemed unable to understand that they were being rescued. When the surgeon, Dr. Albert Hayes, examined them in the Manor's parlor, he found conditions beyond anything he had seen before. In his report dated February 21, 1862, later sent to the Provost Marshal's office in Nashville, Dr. Hayes documented 8 children who appeared to be between 12 and 16 years old, though he believed they might actually be younger because of their poor growth. All showed severe malnutrition, weighing 40 to 60% less than normal. They suffered from rickets caused by lack of sunlight, serious skin diseases including fungal infections and discoloration, advanced dental decay and gum disease, and many untreated injuries, some recent and others badly healed. They had respiratory infections from long exposure to damp air and showed severe psychological damage, including muteness, catatonic behavior, and dissociation. 2 could not walk without help. 3 could not speak clearly. All showed extreme fear reactions to normal sounds and movements, flinching, hiding, and refusing to make eye contact. Dr. Hayes's inspection of the underground chambers revealed even worse details. Beyond the main room were 3 connected chambers joined by narrow passages. One room held 12 crude sleeping pallets made of wood and straw laid out in rows. Another served as a sanitation area with buckets, a drain hole, and a rough washing setup. The third room was the most disturbing. It was barely 8 feet square and contained a chair, a desk, and narrow viewing slits cut into the wall at eye level, allowing someone inside to watch the main chamber without being seen. On the desk lay a leather-bound journal. Inside were carefully written entries describing what the writer called a controlled development protocol. The first entry was dated February 12, 1856. Hayes also found 2 bodies in the sleeping chamber, lying on pallets and covered with thin blankets. They were children, or had once been children. Their bodies were badly decomposed but not fully, suggesting they had died within the last 3 months. Hayes could not determine the exact cause of death in the field, but noted signs of long illness and physical decline that matched the conditions of the living children. Captain Morrison ordered a full investigation at once. Guards were placed on the property. All documents found in the house were secured, including journals, ledgers, and letters. The 8 surviving children were taken to a contraband camp for formerly enslaved people, where Dr. Hayes continued their care. Morrison sent an urgent message to his commanding officer in Nashville describing the discovery and asking for instructions. What followed was a military investigation involving witness statements and document reviews, and finally a decision by federal authorities to suppress nearly all information about the case. Official records mention only irregular management of enslaved people at a plantation in Davidson County. The investigation file was sealed. Officers involved were ordered not to speak about it. Detailed medical reports, testimony, and written evidence were collected, stored, and forgotten. Yet fragments survived. A few letters, notes in official files, a partial medical report found decades later, and statements given by aging veterans in the 1890s reveal something authorities in 1862 believed was too horrible for the public to know. This is that truth. This is what happened at the Harwell estate between February 1856 and November 1861. This is the story of Edmund Harwell, a man who believed he was performing scientific work. And it is the story of 12 children who suffered in such deep darkness that some never fully returned from it, even after they were freed. Edmund Harwell was not born evil. To understand what he became, one must understand what he was, a dangerous mix of intelligence, ambition, and a complete lack of empathy that grew slowly over time. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1814, Edmund was the only child of Marcus Harwell, a schoolmaster who ran a small private academy for the children of merchants and professionals. Marcus was a strict and distant man who valued learning above everything else. He taught Edmund Greek and Latin before the age of 8, and mathematics and philosophy before 10. Praise came only through academic success. Failure brought deep disappointment, which Edmund feared more than physical punishment. Edmund's mother, Sarah, died when he was 6. Marcus never remarried and never spoke of her again. He removed all of her belongings from the house, as if wiping her from memory. Edmund learned that loss should be handled through emotional distance, and that feelings were a weakness. By 14, Edmund had surpassed most of his father's students. Marcus began preparing him for university, pushing him hard in science and natural philosophy. But something troubling appeared in the boy's mind, a focus not on learning for its own sake, but on using knowledge as a means of control. When Edmund was 15, Marcus discovered that his son had been conducting experiments on stray animals, not violent torture, but careful studies of behavior change through control of surroundings and reward and punishment training. Edmund filled 3 full notebooks with notes on how cats and dogs could be taught to perform set actions using repeated and controlled signals. Marcus reacted in a way that revealed much about him. He did not punish Edmund. Instead, he spoke with him at length about scientific process, about the need for precise records, and about how research should be done quietly, without drawing attention from people who would not see the value of detached investigation. This became Edmund's real lesson. It was not that the experiments were wrong, but that they had to be done discreetly. At the age of 17, Edmund enrolled at East Tennessee University, later known as the University of Tennessee, to study agricultural science. The discipline was changing quickly during the 1830s. Scientific farming was replacing older traditions. Landowners who used modern practices like crop rotation, soil testing, and selective breeding achieved much higher yields than those who did not. Edmund stood out immediately. He absorbed everything: botany, chemistry, mechanics, animal care. However, his professors noticed something odd in his thinking. While most students wanted to understand how nature worked, Edmund wanted only to control it. His thesis, submitted in 1836, was titled Environmental Determinism in Agricultural Production, focusing on removing variables to maximize output. The work was technically impressive, but several professors privately found it unsettling. It reduced all living systems, plants, animals, and indirectly people, into simple input and output systems that could be adjusted for efficiency. Edmund graduated with honors at 22 years old. He was academically successful but socially awkward. He had very few friends and little interest in common youthful activities like drinking, gambling, or romance. His true passion was control systems and optimization, and for that he needed money and land. In 1841, Edmund met Louisa Kenton at a social gathering in Knoxville. She was 20, the only child of Charles Kenton, a tobacco trader whose business was failing due to bad investments and poor health. Kenton owned a 600-acre estate in Davidson County, bought years earlier when tobacco prices were strong, now heavily mortgaged and barely producing income. Edmund immediately saw potential. He pursued Louisa with calculated care, not with emotion but with planned displays of reliability and intelligence. He spoke about modern agriculture, improved yields, and how land could be made profitable with proper management. In truth, he was presenting himself as a solution. Louisa was bright but sheltered, educated in music and literature but unaware of business realities. She saw Edmund as a serious man who offered security during uncertain times. After a 4-month courtship, she agreed to marry him. They wed in March 1842. Charles Kenton, relieved and financially desperate, transferred ownership of the Davidson County property to Edmund as part of Louisa's dowry, including the mortgage debt and all assets, among them 43 enslaved workers. Edmund was now a plantation owner. He was 28 years old and finally had the resources he needed. The estate was in terrible condition. The previous manager, Kenton's former partner, had been incompetent before his death in 1840. The land was depleted from years of planting the same crops. Tools were broken. Buildings were decaying, and the enslaved people were underfed, exhausted, and unhealthy. Edmund did not see failure, he saw an experiment. The disorder made it ideal for testing his theories. He began by recording everything. He built a ledger system to track crops, weather, soil quality, fertilizer use, and yield per acre. He listed every piece of equipment and set repair schedules. He counted every asset, down to the smallest item. He also documented the enslaved workforce with the same attention he gave the land and tools. In 1842, most plantation owners treated enslaved laborers as interchangeable workers. Edmund believed this was inefficient. He created individual records for each of the 43 people he legally owned. Each record included physical traits: height, weight, estimated age, identifying marks, health status, injuries, strength, skills, past experience, learning ability, temperament, behavior patterns, relationships, productivity levels, quality of work, and consistency. For 3 months, he conducted what he called an initial evaluation. He watched people work, questioned them, tested them with different tasks, and recorded everything. He then put his system into action. He divided workers into specialized groups. Field laborers were separated by crop type. Skilled trades were assigned to carpentry, blacksmithing, barrel making, domestic service, animal care, and maintenance. Each person was placed where their recorded abilities fit best. He also introduced what he called a performance-based resource system. Workers who met or exceeded productivity targets received slightly better food, marginally lighter hours, and rare privileges such as limited rest time on Sundays. This was not generosity. It was conditioning. Edmund understood from animal training that rewards often worked better than punishment. He structured the entire plantation around this idea. From a financial view, the results were striking. Within 2 years, crop output increased by 40%. Equipment failures dropped, productivity rose, and disciplinary issues declined. Other landowners took notice. By 1845, Edmund was known across Davidson County as a forward-thinking manager. He was invited to speak at agricultural meetings and published articles in farming journals. Plantation owners wrote to him asking for advice. His status grew. The cold, awkward scholar became a respected authority. Louisa managed the household and social duties. She hosted dinners, wrote letters, and fulfilled the expected role of plantation mistress competently, though without passion. Their marriage lacked warmth but functioned smoothly. They slept in separate rooms and spoke mostly about logistics and appearances. Louisa knew her husband was distant and obsessive, more emotionally invested in harvest numbers than people, but she accepted this as normal for their class. Marriage was a practical arrangement, not a love story. What she did not fully grasp, because Edmund hid it carefully, was that he viewed everyone around him as parts of systems to be improved, including her and the people they enslaved. His thoughts were slowly shifting toward a darker question. Could human behavior itself be engineered through controlled environments starting in childhood? In 1847, Edmund attended an agricultural conference in Nashville. There, a professor from the University of Virginia spoke about breeding livestock for specific traits. He explained how early environmental conditions shaped adult behavior and ability, how animals trained from birth developed predictable temperaments. Edmund became obsessed. If animals could be shaped this way, why not people? He began studying child development, education theory, and mental philosophy. He exchanged letters with scholars, bought books on psychology and teaching, and read European writings on environmental determinism. He also began watching the children on his plantation more closely. By 1848, there were 19 children under the age of 12 among the enslaved population. Some were born on the estate. Others came with new purchases as Edmund expanded operations. These children lived with their families, helped with small tasks, and grew up within the usual community structure. Edmund saw inefficiency. He believed these children were being raised in disordered environments that produced mediocre adults. Their skills and habits developed randomly instead of through structured conditioning. What if children were raised in carefully controlled settings where every part of their development was managed to produce specific results? What if workers could be created who were not only strong but mentally conditioned for obedience, efficiency, and specialized labor? He began drafting plans for what he called a controlled developmental system. In 1849, he turned an unused storage building into sleeping space for children. He told the enslaved community that children older than 6 would be separated from their families for education and skill learning. He presented this as a modern and helpful step that would prepare them for more valuable kinds of work. The response was immediate fear and anger. Parents begged to keep their children with them. They were denied. Edmund had legal power to do as he pleased with his property, including breaking families apart. In May 1849, 17 children were moved into the new dormitory. Edmund hired through middlemen to hide his real goals, a tutor from Knoxville. He was a young man named William Crane who needed money and agreed to teach basic reading, writing, and math to enslaved children without asking many questions about the larger purpose. Edmund created strict daily routines. Wake up at sunrise, morning exercises, simple lessons, training in specific skills, afternoon physical work suited to their age, and evening meal. and then what Edmund called a social period before sleep. To people outside the plantation, this sounded almost progressive, a landowner investing in education and training for future labor. Some nearby planters even praised Edmund for being forward-thinking. But the truth was far darker. The education was not meant to free minds. It was meant to shape behavior. The social periods were not free time but observation sessions. Edmund watched how the children interacted. He recorded their actions, tested different group setups, and looked for patterns that produced obedience. He kept careful records on every child, how they reacted to authority, how they handled stress, what rewards motivated them, what punishments changed their behavior most effectively. He treated them like test subjects, running experiments on young minds, and he learned from every result. Over 3 years, Edmund sharpened his ideas about how children could be molded and controlled. He became convinced that normal child raising was wasteful and poorly managed. He believed the best human development required strict scientific control. By 1852, he had formed a full theory. He believed children were most flexible in behavior, and that this time allowed specific traits to be engineered. Traditional family life, he decided, introduced too many uncontrolled factors. Parents, friends, random experiences, all of these interfered with proper conditioning. What was needed, he concluded, was a pure environment, total control, the removal of all random influence. He began planning a more extreme experiment, one that required total isolation, one that had to be hidden from everyone, even people on his own plantation who might object or report it. An experiment underground. In early 1853, Edmund started planning what he called in his journals the perfect developmental space, a place where children could be raised under complete environmental control. He spent months thinking through the design. The space had to be isolated, hidden, and fully controlled. Light, temperature, and sound all had to be adjustable. It had to support people for long periods with little direct contact. It also had to allow observation without interaction. His answer was to build underground. Chambers below ground would naturally stay cool, block outside light and sound, and remain hidden if designed carefully. In May 1853, Edmund told workers he was expanding the root cellar for cold storage. He hired a mason from Murfreesboro who specialized in cutting through bedrock. The man was quiet, skilled, and did not ask unnecessary questions. Edmund supervised closely but shared little. He said the space was for storing crops and improving food preservation. This was believable. Wealthy landowners often upgraded their property. The work lasted 7 months. Enslaved workers did most of the heavy labor. They dug rock, carried debris, and mixed mortar. They worked in rotating groups so no one saw the full project. Edmund controlled information carefully, showing each group only what they needed to see. By December 1853, the work was finished. Below the root cellar, reachable through a hidden hatch that was carefully disguised, was a system of chambers carved 15 feet into Tennessee bedrock. The main room measured 20 by 30 feet with an 8-foot ceiling. This was the main living area. Edmund installed oil lamps fixed to the ceiling with ropes running through hidden channels up to the cellar, so he could control light without entering. He built a ventilation system using narrow shafts drilled at angles through the rock. These opened in wooded areas about 50 yards from the manor and were hard to notice. They were too small for escape but allowed fresh air. A sleeping room connected to the main space through a low passage. It measured 15 by 20 feet. Edmund had 12 sleeping pallets built in rows. Each had a wooden frame and a straw mattress. Shelves were added for clothes and small personal items. There was a sanitation room, 10 feet square, with wooden waste buckets, a drain leading into a natural underground crack, and a simple washing area with a water barrel. The design was rough but usable based on prison layouts Edmund had studied. There was also an observation room. This was the most telling feature. It was a small space, 8 feet square, reachable only from the root cellar through a separate passage. Narrow slits at eye level connected it to the main chamber. A person inside could watch everything without being seen or heard. Edmund furnished the underground rooms with basic items: wooden stools, a table, storage cabinets, buckets, rope, and simple tools. He added a pulley system with a basket to lower food and water. This allowed supplies to be delivered without entering the space. He also installed a speaking tube, a pipe that connected the observation room to the main chamber, so he could speak to the children without revealing himself. Every part of the design reflected Edmund's belief in total control. Each detail gave him power over the environment while limiting the subject's ability to change anything about their lives. By January 1854, the chambers were fully prepared. Edmund placed carefully chosen books inside, religious texts that stressed obedience and acceptance, simple learning materials, nothing that encouraged questioning or independent thought. Then he waited. The rooms remained empty for 2 years. During this time, Edmund ran the plantation, continued the surface training program, and planned the next stage. He waited for the right children. He waited for conditions that would limit risk of discovery, and he waited for the mental state that would allow him to act. That state arrived in March 1855 when Louisa died. Louisa Harwell went into labor on March 8, 1855. It was her first pregnancy. She was 34 years old, not unusually old for the time, but not young. The pregnancy had been difficult. She suffered from sickness, exhaustion, and swelling. Dr. Nathan Pierce, the nearest physician, came to the manor. Labor started in the evening and lasted through the night. By morning, it was clear something was wrong. The baby was positioned badly. Louisa grew weaker. Dr. Pierce attempted a forceps delivery, a risky method even when done well. The child, a boy, was delivered stillborn at 11:40 a.m. On March 9, Louisa, bleeding heavily and exhausted, died about 2 hours later. Edmund did not react with normal grief. People who saw him afterward noticed this. Dr. Pierce, neighbors who visited, and the minister who led the funeral all commented on his strange calm. He did not cry. His voice did not shake. He spoke about the deaths in cold, practical terms like discussing failed crops. He told one neighbor it was unfortunate, but medical science was not advanced enough yet. He said that with proper research, such outcomes might one day be prevented. Pierce found his behavior unsettling but blamed shock. The minister suggested Edmund was hiding grief behind discipline. Neighbors whispered that he had always been odd, and that this loss revealed his true self. None of them understood the truth. Edmund was not suppressing grief. This was simply who he was. He had never loved Louisa in any emotional sense. She had been a functional part of his system. Now that part had failed. He felt no sadness, only annoyance at the disruption of his orderly life. Her death did change something, though. It pushed him further. In the weeks after the funeral, Edmund locked himself in his study with his journals and books. He wrote constantly about control, order, and human development. His writing from this time shows a shift from cold planning to something more dangerous. On March 24, 1855, he wrote that nature was chaos, birth, death, disease, all random and wasteful. But human intelligence could create order. He believed people did not have to accept natural outcomes if better ones could be designed. He compared it to farming, writing that a farmer who lets crops grow wild accepts failure. Puncttiaon is a fool. A planter who lets worker training happen by accident is just as foolish. And a man who believes human ability is fixed by luck instead of open to careful improvement is rejecting the basic idea of scientific progress. He started writing letters with people from rejected and false sciences. Phrenologists who said skull size could explain behavior. Early thinkers who would later shape psychology and who tested risky and disputed methods. He read all he could about sensory isolation, about studies on loneliness, about shaping behavior through environment. By the fall of 1855, Edmund had convinced himself of several dangerous ideas. First, that human behavior and skill came almost fully from childhood environment. Second, that normal child rearing was messy and flawed and filled with random forces that blocked proper growth. Third, that perfect human growth needed a pure environment, full control of every influence on the growing mind. He believed this control was not only possible but morally right in the name of science. He began preparing to use the underground rooms he had built 2 years before. He needed test subjects and a way to choose them. From October to December 1855, Edmund spent many weeks watching the children on his plantation. He sat in on their training. He watched them while they worked. He studied his detailed records of their traits and actions. He searched for clear traits. His journals from this time list what he wanted. Ages 6 to 10. young enough to be shaped easily but old enough to live without constant care that would demand too much effort. Physical state mostly healthy with no clear disabilities or long illnesses that could harm the experiment or need treatment he could not give. Mental profile calm and manageable, able to follow orders, not given to extreme emotion that could upset the group. Social separation, this was the key point. Edmund wanted children with little bond to adult family, those sold away from parents, orphans, or children from families he had broken apart on purpose over the years. This last rule shows Edmund knew his plan would work better if fewer people would ask where the children went. By January 1856 he had chosen his subjects. Group 1 was 3 boys and 2 girls bought within the last year from Virginia and Kentucky. They had been taken from their parents during sale. They arrived already hurt by loss and fear. They had no family ties on the land. Their absence might be noticed, but no one would press hard for answers. Group 2 was the orphaned, a brother and sister aged 8 and 6. Their mother had died of fever in August 1854. Their father Samuel worked the far fields and saw them rarely due to Edmund's planned work schedules. The children had lived in the shared dormitory for over a year. Group 3 was the communally raised, 4 children born on the estate but raised under Edmund's group child system begun in 1849. They were taken from birth mothers early and raised together with little personal contact. Edmund created this system for efficiency and, as his journals show, as an early test in conditioning. Group 4 was the planned isolate. 1 girl aged 9 whose family Edmund sold to a plantation in northern Mississippi in September 1855. He arranged the sale to create a lone child for his study. Her name was Denina. She lived in the dormitory after her family left, confused and grieving. 12 children total. Edmund gave them numbers in his journal, subject 1 through subject 12. He stripped them of identity and turned them into test objects. On February 10, 1856, Edmund made his final checks. He filled the underground rooms with supplies: dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, water barrels. He placed selected books on shelves. He tested the lights, the pulleys, the airflow. Everything was set. Edmund started early. At sunrise on February 12, 1856, he went to the children's dormitory and told William Crane, the tutor, that 12 students were being moved to a special training program in another location. Crane would teach only the remaining children. Crane, who had learned not to question Edmund, simply nodded and asked nothing. Edmund then spoke to the 12 children and told them to gather their belongings. They were moving to new rooms where they would receive advanced lessons and important training. The children obeyed because they had no choice. Some looked scared, others looked hopeful. Maybe the new place would be better than the crowded dormitory. Edmund spoke calmly and firmly, showing nothing strange. He led them across the plantation in the early light. A line of children followed a man who owned them fully by law. Any adults who saw them knew not to ask questions. Such choices were Edmund's alone. They reached the manor. Edmund led them to the root cellar door. Some children paused. The cellar was dark and unknown. Edmund told them evenly that this was only the entrance to their new rooms, and that they should go down the steps. They went into the cellar. Edmund lit lanterns to brighten the space. He walked to a corner where a hidden hatch lay, and pulled away the sacks covering it. He said their new rooms were below and told them to climb down carefully. He opened the hatch. Light fell down the shaft and showed the wooden ladder. The children stared into the dark in fear. Edmund chose the oldest boy, subject 1, aged 10, named Marcus, who had been on the land 8 months, and ordered him to go first. Marcus hesitated. Edmund's voice turned hard. He told him to obey at once or face severe punishment. Marcus climbed down. Edmund ordered the rest to follow one by one. Some cried, some were silent. All were afraid and none could refuse. Edmund climbed down after them with a lamp. For the next 2 hours Edmund showed them the underground rooms. He showed the sleeping area and said each child had a set place. He showed the sanitation room and explained the rules for cleanliness. He showed the pulley system and where food and water would arrive. He showed the books and said there would be study time every day. He laid out rules in firm, clear words. Wake when he called each morning. Follow the daily plan he set. Keep the rooms clean and ordered. Obey every order fully and at once. Work together. Fighting would be punished. Never touch the ladder or try to reach the hatch. Never make loud noise that could travel through the air shafts. He spoke as if this life were normal, as if living underground in darkness was ordinary training. Some children cried. Edmund paid no attention. He finished speaking, climbed the ladder, and returned to the cellar. He looked down at 12 faces staring up from the dark, afraid, confused, and lost. He said their first meal would come that evening. He told them to settle in and read the books provided. He said he would speak to them again the next morning. Then he shut the hatch and locked it. The sound of the bolts sliding into place, heavy and final, was the last outside sound they heard for many hours. Edmund went up the cellar steps, returned to the house, and entered his study. He opened his journal to a new page and wrote the date February 12, 1856. Below he wrote Controlled Development Protocol Day 1. He began writing careful notes about how the subjects reacted to the new environment and baseline behavior for later comparison. He showed no sign that he had done something deeply evil. In his mind he had only begun important work. Below, in total darkness, after Edmund put out the lamps, using the control ropes, 12 children entered the start of their nightmare. The first hours in the dark were beyond words. Some screamed, others cried softly. The youngest subject, 12, a 6-year-old girl named Ada, called again and again for her brother until her voice failed. They held close, afraid of the blackness, confused by stale air and stone walls, unable to understand what was happening or why. Time lost all meaning. With no light and no way to know hours, life became an endless moment of fear. When Edmund finally returned the next morning, though the children could not know it was morning, and opened the hatch, light poured down like a force. Children who had been in darkness for about 14 hours covered their eyes and cried in pain from the sudden light. Edmund called down it, "Morning. You will begin your first day of training now." He lowered the lamp system with the pulleys so light filled the underground chambers. After that he sent down a basket with their breakfast. Inside were cornmeal mush, water, and 12 wooden spoons. "You will eat in an orderly manner." His voice echoed from somewhere above them. "Divide the food equally among yourselves. When you are finished, place the empty basket and the spoons back into the pulleys so they can be raised. You have 30 minutes. The children were starving, confused, and frightened, and they did not question him. They ate fast and without care. Some argued and grabbed for more until the older children stepped in and forced order. When they finished, they followed instructions and sent the basket back up. Edmund pulled it up, inspected the empty bowls, and wrote notes in his journal. He recorded how they shared food, how quickly conflict appeared, and how signs of leadership and hierarchy were already forming. Then he began the next part of the day. He spoke through the speaking tube that connected his observation room to the main chamber, a feature the children had not yet understood or located. Edmund's voice came from the walls themselves, sounding everywhere and nowhere at once. "You will now begin educational instruction," the voice said. "On the shelves in the main chamber, you will find books. The oldest children will read aloud while the others listen. Begin with the book titled Moral Lessons for Youth. Open it to page 1 and start reading. I will be listening." The children looked around, trying to see where the voice came from. Subject 1, Marcus, a 10-year-old boy, eventually found the books. His hands shook as he opened the volume and began to read aloud. This became the daily pattern. Edmund controlled everything from above. Light, food, water, movement, learning, rest. The children had no choice, no privacy, and no control over any part of their lives. They never saw the person who held power over them. He stayed hidden in the observation station or the root cellar above, a voice without a face, an unseen authority. The effect on them was fast and damaging. Children who had been mostly healthy and calm before began to show signs of deep trauma. Some withdrew into silence. Some became angry or violent. Some seemed to drift away inside themselves. The younger ones cried often. The older children tried to keep peace and comfort the little ones, but they were terrified too. By the third day, Subject 5, an 8-year-old boy named Joseph, stopped eating. He sat still on his sleeping pallet and did not respond when others spoke to him or shook him gently. Edmund recorded this in his journal as resistance behavior, an attempt to regain control by refusing food. His response was planned and cold. He spoke to the group through the tube. Subject 5 has chosen not to eat. This is his decision. His food will not be given to others. It will be removed. When Subject 5 chooses to follow feeding rules, he may inform the group and normal rations will return. Until that time, all subjects will receive smaller portions because of Subject 5's non-compliance. This was intentional mental pressure. He turned the group against one child by making everyone suffer for one person's refusal. By the 4th day, the other children begged Joseph to eat. By the 5th day, weak from hunger and crushed by the pressure of the group, Joseph began eating again. Edmund recorded this as a successful use of group pressure to enforce obedience. By the end of the first week, the children had learned what Edmund wanted them to learn. They had no power. They could not escape. They could not say no. They could not even see who ruled their lives. All they could do was obey and hope obedience might bring freedom someday. It would not. Edmund created a strict routine and followed it with exact precision. Every day was the same. Morning, though the children had no way to know when morning truly was. They only knew when Edmund chose to wake them. The hatch would open a little. His voice would call down, "Morning begins," and light would come on through the lamp system. Breakfast would arrive by pulley, usually cornmeal mush or porridge. Sometimes there was molasses, always water, always just enough to keep them alive, never enough to feel full. Morning education followed. 2 hours of reading from books Edmund selected. The texts focused on obedience to authority, acceptance of rank, and the value of silent labor. Edmund listened from above and sometimes interrupted to ask questions or correct answers. Then came physical exercise. Edmund demanded daily movements, jumping, stretching, running in place. He watched through narrow observation slits, timing them with a pocket watch. He noted who tired quickly and who lasted longer. This was not for health, it was for data. Midday food came next. It was slightly better than breakfast, but still small. Beans, sometimes salt, sometimes pork, cornbread, water. Afternoon training followed. Edmund lowered baskets with objects to be sorted. He ordered specific movements in exact sequences. He gave simple problems to solve. He called these lessons training, but they were really experiments. He tested obedience, fine movement under stress, and thinking ability while afraid and hungry. Evening instruction came after. More reading, or Edmund lectured through the speaking tube. He talked about correct behavior, knowing one's place, and false scientific ideas about human growth and control. The evening meal was small again like breakfast. Then darkness. When Edmund decided evening had arrived, the lights went out. The children were left in complete blackness until he chose to wake them again. This pattern repeated again and again. Day after day. Week after week. The sameness itself became a form of torture. Life was reduced to a loop controlled fully by someone they could not see. Even worse were Edmund's changes to the routine. He altered things on purpose to watch how they reacted. Some days he kept them in darkness far longer than usual, 10 hours, 12 hours, even 14, writing notes about how lack of light affected behavior. Some days he woke them many times during the night, breaking their sleep and watching how tired minds obeyed. Some days he cut food portions to find the lowest level needed to keep them functioning. Some days he created conflict by giving more food to some children than others or forcing them to compete. He wrote everything down with no emotion. Day 23. Reduced Subject 3's rations to observe peer response. Subjects 6 and 7 shared their own food. Evidence of strong social bonds. May require isolation to reduce. Day 31. Extended darkness to 16 hours. Subjects showed higher anxiety when light returned. Louder voices, repeated questions about time, restless movement, useful data on time confusion. Day 47. Introduced unequal food parcels. Subjects tried to share at first. Repeated daily. By day 4, cooperation breaking, stronger subjects taking more, weaker subjects accepting lower status. Hierarchy forming as expected. His writing showed a man who had lost all human feeling. He described children in pain the same way he described soil or crops. Children can adapt to terrible conditions. The 12 children underground began to form ways to survive. Marcus, the 10-year-old, became the leader. He was the oldest and strongest, and others followed him. He kept order, settled fights, and enforced Edmund's rules. He knew disorder would bring worse punishment. Benjamin and Sarah, both 9, helped him. The younger children stayed close to them for safety. Ada, 6 years old, stayed beside Sarah all the time, slept near her, and cried only to her when fear became overwhelming. They made small rituals to cope. When darkness came, they held hands and told stories they remembered. Old tales, Bible stories, anything that used voice and touch to fight the dark. They gave each other jobs. Some handled water, some cleaned, some arranged sleeping spaces. These tiny choices helped them feel a little human. They also learned quiet resistance. They gave Edmund the answers he wanted to hear, but among themselves they kept their own rules and bonds. They obeyed on the outside and resisted on the inside. This survival came at a cost. The children taken underground in February 1856 were not the same 6 months later. Long stress, hunger, no sunlight, and constant fear changed them. Their bodies showed it. Muscles weakened. Growth slowed. Skin and teeth suffered. Hair thinned. A report written by Dr. Hayes in 1862 would later record these changes. The damage to their minds was worse. Some children became silent and distant, staring for hours. Others developed repeated movements, rocking back and forth, scratching lines into stone, lining up objects again and again without stopping. Several of the children began showing dissociative behaviors, mentally withdrawing during moments of extreme stress, becoming unresponsive to stimuli, and then illness started spreading among them. In early June 1856, Subject 7, Thomas, age 7, came down with a fever. It began with coughing and fatigue, symptoms that the other children initially thought were just tiredness. But within a few days, Thomas's condition worsened. His fever climbed higher, his breathing became labored. A rattling cough echoed through the underground chambers. The other children, terrified, called up through the hatch during food delivery, pleading with Edmund to help Thomas. Edmund, watching through the observation slits, noted Thomas's symptoms and lowered down basic medicine, willow bark tea for fever, and a tonic of his own concoction. But he did not bring Thomas above ground. He did not summon Dr. Pierce. He simply gave basic remedies and continued his observations. Thomas almost certainly had pneumonia, a bacterial infection worsened by the damp underground environment, poor ventilation, and malnutrition weakening his immune system. With proper medical attention, he might have survived, but without it, his chances were slim. The other children tried to care for him. They gave him extra water from their own rations, kept him as comfortable as possible, and took turns sitting with him when he seemed frightened. Subject 2, Benjamin, stayed almost constantly by Thomas's side, holding his hand, telling him stories to keep him calm. Thomas died on June 18, 1856, in the early morning hours. Benjamin, who was with him, called up to Edmund when the hatch opened for the morning routine. "Thomas is dead, sir." He stopped breathing. Edmund's response, as recorded in his journal, was coldly clinical. Subject 7 expired at approximately 60-30 hours. Cause of death likely pneumonia with complications from environmental factors. Will remove body during evening cycle to minimize psychological impact on remaining subjects. That evening, Edmund descended into the chambers for the first time since the initial day. He carried Thomas's body up the ladder while the 11 surviving children watched in horror and grief. He gave no comfort, no acknowledgement of their loss, no explanation. He simply removed the body, closed the hatch, and buried Thomas in an unmarked grave deep in the woods far from the main plantation buildings. To the 11 children left below, Thomas had simply vanished. Edmund told them only that Thomas had been moved to another location for medical care, but they knew the truth. They had seen Thomas die. They had seen Edmund carry his body away. They understood with horrifying clarity that they too might die underground and disappear without recognition or burial. The psychological impact on the children was immense. Their fragile hope that obedience might eventually lead to release was shattered. They realized now that compliance offered no safety. They were not part of a program that would end. They were trapped in a tomb. After Thomas's death, Edmund's journal entries began showing signs of serious mental decline. His handwriting became sloppy. His normally precise records grew erratic. He missed days without writing, then filled pages frantically. The tone shifted from clinical detachment to defensive justification. June 20, 1856. Subject 7's death represents an unfortunate but predictable outcome of inadequate immune response to environmental pathogens. This does not invalidate the methodology. Medical complications are variables in any biological research, adjusting protocols to account for health maintenance requirements. June 25, 1856. Remaining subjects show grief that disrupts behavioral patterns. This is problematic. Emotional bonds may be confounding variables, perhaps eliminated by total isolation from the start. Preliminary hypothesis suggested group environment would yield social hierarchy data, but effective bonds may introduce too much variability. July 3, 1856. Observation sessions increasingly difficult. Subjects stare at observation slits when they hear movement. Awareness may affect natural behavior. Consider redesigning protocols to remove subject awareness. Edmund began to see that his experiment was failing to produce useful results. 6 months of careful observation revealed nothing scientifically valuable, only that children suffer when confined underground in horrific conditions. Yet he could not admit failure. To do so would require acknowledging the person he had become. Instead, he reframed the experiment in his mind, adjusting hypotheses, convincing himself that the lack of results was due to methodology, not the immorality of his actions. He reduced his direct interactions to the bare minimum. Where he had once conducted education sessions and social conditioning exercises, he now only maintained basic life support, delivering food and water, keeping the light cycles, removing waste through the pulley system when the smell became unbearable. He spent hours analyzing his journals, searching for patterns to validate his work, but found none. The data showed only suffering. He began drinking heavily, something he had rarely done before. Neighbors noticed his withdrawn, deteriorating appearance. Some assumed he was grieving for Louisa. Others whispered he had always been strange, now tipping into instability. No one guessed the truth. In September 1856, Subject 9, Ruth, age 8, injured herself falling from the storage shelves. The children sometimes climbed the shelves for exercise or play, and Ruth cut her leg on broken pottery. The wound was deep, but could have healed with proper care. The children called up to Edmund, showing him the bleeding leg during the next meal delivery. He lowered bandages and alcohol for cleaning. But in the damp, unsanitary underground conditions, with no proper medical supplies and no way to keep the wound clean, infection was nearly inevitable. Within days, Ruth's leg swelled and turned discolored. She developed a fever. By September 3rd, she was delirious. By September 4th, she was dead. Edmund's journal entry. Subject 9 expired due to infection from traumatic injury. Septicemia likely cause of death. Environmental conditions present ongoing health risks that may require additional mitigation protocols or experiment duration reduction. The mention of experiment duration reduction was the first time Edmund hinted at ending the project, though it remained an abstract thought, not a real plan. Once again, Edmund removed a body under cover of darkness. The children watched helplessly as another of their number disappeared. 10 remained. The next year, from autumn 1856 through 1857, passed in grinding monotony. Punctuated by moments of extreme suffering, Edmund kept basic protocols but with less engagement. His journal entries grew sparse. October 1856, protocols continued. Subjects comply, no major incidents. December 1856, adjusted rations due to rising food costs. Subjects adapting. February 1857, 1 year after initiation. Overall health declining, persistent minor ailments, growth rates far below age norms, varying psychological conditions, several subjects showing marked behavioral changes. The children underground were suffering deep trauma. Constant darkness, malnutrition, and lack of normal childhood experiences were causing permanent harm. Some showed signs of severe depression, lying motionless for hours, refusing interaction, speaking only when necessary. Others developed anxiety disorders, constant hypervigilance, panic at sudden sounds, terror when lights went out. Subbed 12 Ada, age 7, stopped speaking entirely, communicating only with gestures and sounds. Subject 8, Dina, whose family Edmund had deliberately sold away, developed obsessive rituals, washing hands repeatedly, counting items, arranging stones in exact patterns. Edmund recorded these behaviors clinically, without understanding their meaning. He did not recognize them as symptoms of severe trauma. To him, the children were only subjects, and their suffering was data. Above ground, life continued normally on the plantation. Enslaved workers tended fields and buildings, produced crops. Some suspected something was wrong. They noticed 12 children had disappeared. They observed Edmund's instability and sometimes heard faint noises through ventilation shafts at night that could have been voices from below. But they could do nothing. Speaking out risked punishment. They had no legal power, and white authorities would not have believed enslaved people accusing a respected plantation owner. So they watched silently, trapped in the same system that allowed Edmund to imprison children underground with impunity. As 1857 turned to 1858 and 1858 to 1859, Edmund's involvement decreased further. He had stopped pretending the experiment yielded results. His journals now contained only minimal maintenance notes, yet he could not stop. Stopping would mean deciding what to do with the 10 children below, and every option seemed impossible. Release them. They would talk about what had happened. Even if people dismissed rumors about enslaved children, enough details would spread to ruin Edmund's reputation and expose the horror he had created. Punctuation could trigger scrutiny. Sell them. Their physical and mental state would immediately raise questions about how they had been treated. No buyer would accept them without demanding explanations, so kill them. Edmund had reached a level of deep moral corruption. Yet he still had enough self-awareness to realize that directly murdering 10 children would make him what he refused to admit to himself, a monster. So he did nothing. The children stayed underground, living in a space between life and death, while Edmund kept just enough life support going and avoided facing the full weight of his crimes. Then history intervened. Political tensions between North and South, simmering for decades, finally erupted. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. Tennessee followed in June 1861. The Civil War began, and Edmund Harwell, confronting a world where federal armies could seize his property and uncover his secrets, had to make a final choice about the 10 children in darkness. By the fall of 1861, federal forces were advancing into Tennessee. Nashville would fall to Union control in February 1862. Edmund, a known supporter of the Confederacy, realized that his property might be taken, occupied, or searched. He started making plans to escape, selling some of his assets, packing valuables, and preparing to move to Confederate-controlled territory further south. But the children created an impossible problem. He could not take them. He could not set them free. He could not stay at the estate to care for them. His final journal entry, dated November 15, 1861, reads, "The subjects below represent a difficulty that cannot travel with relocation. The most practical solution requires action I find myself unable to undertake." The entry ends mid-sentence. The rest of the page is blank. Edmund seemingly could not even write what he was thinking. Evidence suggests he made one last descent to the underground chambers sometime in mid-November 1861. He lowered a significant quantity of provisions, enough food and water in theory for several months. He may have meant this as a way to delay his decision, providing basic survival needs and then simply leaving, letting chance decide what would happen. Or he may have done it knowing the supplies would eventually run out, knowing the children would slowly starve in darkness, but convincing himself that he had not killed them directly. We cannot know his reasoning because he never recorded it. In late November 1861, Edmund Harwell left his estate. He secured the hatch. He left the manor mostly intact and disappeared. The 10 children below were abandoned in total darkness with limited provisions, no escape, and no sense of whether anyone would ever return. When Private Ketchum opened that hatch on February 19, 1862, the children had been underground for almost 6 years. 2 more had died in the months following Edmund's departure. The supplies Edmund left had run out in late January 1862. By the time federal soldiers found them, the children had been without food for about 3 weeks. They had survived by licking condensed moisture from the stone walls and sheer willpower. Dr. Hayes's medical examination, conducted over several days, documented conditions that shocked even the most experienced military personnel. Physically, all 8 survivors showed severe malnutrition, with body weights 50 to 60% below what would be expected. Their growth had been seriously stunted. Children who should have been in early adolescence looked far younger. They had rickets from lack of vitamin D, causing bone deformities. Their skin was pale, almost translucent from years without sunlight. Many had untreated infections, injuries, dental decay, and breathing problems. Psychologically, their condition was even more disturbing. Several children were initially mute, unable or unwilling to speak. They flinched from light, covered their eyes, and were extremely distressed in open spaces. Dr. Hayes described them as showing complete institutional adaptation to captivity. They expected instructions for everything: when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak. Freedom frightened them because they no longer knew how to function without strict external control. 2 were catatonic for several days after rescue, staring blankly and unresponsive to comfort. 1 engaged in repetitive self-harm, hitting his head against walls, biting his arms. Another could not tolerate being alone, panicking if separated from the group, even briefly. Hayes concluded his report with unusually strong emotion for a military medical record. "I have seen war casualties, victims of violence, and various forms of suffering, but I have never encountered trauma so profound and systematic. These children have endured conditions that go beyond ordinary cruelty. The damage, physical, mental, developmental, may never heal. Whoever committed this act carried out evil so immense it defies comprehension and demands justice." But justice did not come. Captain Morrison sent his investigation to his commanding officer in Nashville. The report moved up the military chain. At each level, officers were shocked. But politics intervened. The Union Army in Tennessee was in a delicate position. They controlled territory but needed the population's cooperation or at least passive compliance. They aimed to show that federal occupation was fair and orderly. The story of Edmund Harwell was politically sensitive for many reasons. Racial politics: the victims were enslaved children. This made Edmund's crimes horrific, but also complicated prosecution. Enslaved people were legally property, and Tennessee law offered almost no protection. Trying to prosecute a white plantation owner for crimes against his property, no matter how extreme, had almost no legal precedent. Confederate sympathy. Much of Tennessee sympathized with the Confederacy. Edmund was a known Confederate supporter who had fled Union control. Prosecuting him could have created a martyr, inflaming anti-Union sentiment. Military priorities: the Army was at war, focusing on strategy and operations, not on investigating individuals who had already escaped. Victim testimony: the 8 surviving children were deeply traumatized. Even if authorities tried to use their testimony, their mental state made them unreliable witnesses, easy for defense lawyers to challenge. Federal authorities quietly decided to close the investigation. Reports were sealed. Officers were instructed not to discuss the case. The official files would note only minor irregularities and then be archived. The 8 children were moved to a contraband camp, one of many set up for formerly enslaved people freed by Union forces. There they joined thousands of displaced persons. Their individual stories were lost in the chaos of war. Edmund Harwell was not pursued. No charges were filed. His name appeared on no wanted lists. He had committed one of the most horrific crimes in a region full of atrocities and faced no legal consequences. The fate of the 8 survivors after rescue is mostly unknown. Records from contraband camps were incomplete. Families were separated, children were orphaned or lost, names were changed or misspelled. The 8 children from the Harwell estate, subjects 1 through 12 minus the 4 who died, disappeared into history. Only fragments remain. A Union Army chaplain's diary from March 1862 briefly mentions, working with traumatized children rescued from cave imprisonment, trying to offer spiritual comfort, though they seem unreachable, lost in darkness even in daylight. A Freedmen's Bureau note in 1865 refers to a group of children with unusual psychological issues, claiming years underground during slavery, likely trauma-induced or exaggerated accounts of typical plantation confinement. An 1883 newspaper interview with Mrs. Eyre recounts a story of being held underground, dismissed as fanciful. Whether any of the 8 survived the war, found family, or built lives beyond trauma, we do not know. Their names were not recorded, their testimonies were lost. They were erased from history as thoroughly as Edmund tried to erase them from the world. Edmund Harwell's fate is also unclear. Confederate records were incomplete and often destroyed. tracking individuals in wartime was difficult. Some unconfirmed reports suggest he reached Atlanta in early 1862, possibly working as a clerk in the Confederate commissary. A March 1862 roster lists an E. Harwell in that office, but without further details. A death certificate in Richmond, Virginia, August 1863, records Edmund Harwell, age 49, dying of typhoid fever in a military hospital. The age and location match, but confirmation is impossible. Another memoir by a Confederate veteran recalls meeting a man named Harwell in South Carolina in 1864, a strange and broken person, haunted by private demons. This man allegedly died by suicide late that year, though no official record confirms it. We do not know if Edmund died in 1863-1864, or survived the war under a new identity. We do not know if he ever felt guilt or continued believing in his work until the end. We know only that he committed an atrocity, escaped justice, and vanished from history.